All right, first up in the parameters explanation video, we're going to do the Pixhawk. I don't know if anyone in the class will have this one, but just in case this was the very first one we used, and we kind of phased out after that as far as the class goes. But once you have things wired up, you need to configure them in Mission Planner to allow your flight controller to actually communicate with the devices you've connected. Okay, so here's this Pixhawk overview page. You can find this just by searching Pixhawk pinout or Pixhawk ArduPilot or something like that. I'll leave a link to it there as well just to help you out. But it's pretty easy to find. Okay, so we have our Pixhawk, all the different ports and things right here. And then down here in the bottom we have this image here. Now this is upside down. I don't know why they placed it that way. Normally people would kind of tend to think of the top of the Pixhawk as being like this, even though the arrow does point this way, just because the lettering's this way, I guess. Anyways, we're going to take a look at this diagram here and help us decipher what we're doing. Okay, so you probably have plugged your telemetry radio into the telemetry 1 port, which is actually going to be this one right here, okay, where it says SER1, excuse me, or serial 1. Okay, so once you plug your telemetry radio in and it's correctly wired and you've powered it up and everything, and you can see that it's turned on and it's looking around for its pair. It's found its other telemetry radio, so your telemetry radios can see each other, right? They're both solid green LEDs. But now you need to make sure that you can actually connect to your aircraft from Mission Planner via the telemetry radios. If the function is not turned on in your flight controller, the communication won't be able to happen. Okay, so if we see SER1, that stands for serial 1. A little bit bigger there we go, okay? So we're going to go over into Mission Planner. I'm connected to a simulated copter right now, but that doesn't matter. We're going to look at our serial ports. So we're going to type in serial, like that, okay, in the search bar here in the full parameter list under the config tab. And I'm going to start with serial 0, just to kind of show you guys a couple of these here. Serial 0 is actually a USB port on pretty much every flight controller, I think. So don't mess with that one. If you mess it up, you might not be able to communicate with your flight controller anymore. Don't touch serial 0. We have serial 1. If we change over here our search terms, we get serial 1, and we start to see a commonality. Serial 1, we see a protocol, an options, baud. Okay, go to serial 2. Okay, protocol, options, baud, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so if we go back here, we say serial 1 was what I plugged it into. So let's search for serial 1. So let's go back to the page here so I can show you serial 1 to LEM1. Okay, so we're going to go to serial 1 here. We're going to make sure we set the protocol correctly. You shouldn't have to set anything else really besides the protocol. You just want to make sure for your telemetry radio connection, wherever that's plugged into, whatever UART that's on, that you have it set to 2, which is Mavlink 2. Okay, so that's a telemetry protocol. We want to make sure if it's not set to 2, if it was set to 6 or something, we set it to 2, and then we write parameters. Okay, that is our telemetry radio setup. You should not have to configure the baud rate up here, though it should be set by default at 57. You might have to configure this, write the parameters, reboot your quadcopter, and then double check. It's always good to double check after a reboot. But if the device is connected to the aircraft and you reboot with it connected, it should auto-configure the baud rate, I believe. But if you need to manually adjust it, telemetry radios should be at 57 by default. Okay, so there's our telemetry radio. Okay, the other part of the setup where you're doing your NetID and stuff is in the NetID assignment, but at least now it should be working. You should be able to connect to it with your computer on the default NetID and communicate with ArduPilot on the flight controller remotely, or I guess wirelessly, I should say. Okay, that's the first step there. The other half of this is the GPS. Okay, so let's go back here, your GPS. You're probably going to plug it into the GPS port, I would imagine. And so if you do that, we go over here to the overview. We see GPS here. It says SER3, so serial 3. We'll go into Mission Planner, and we'll type serial 3. Okay, and serial 3 is configured for 5. And you look at the list here, it says 5 is GPS. Perfect. So it's already configured in my example here. Yours may or may not be configured already, so you'd want to make sure you edited that. Instead of 7, say we put it to 5 and say write params. Okay. And there you have it. So now our GPS should be able to be found by the flight controller when it boots up. Okay, remember most of these things with external devices, you have to configure it, write it, make sure it's saved, then reboot the copter like with a battery, a full reboot, in order for these things to power up. Another note there, if you've wired your device, whatever it is, into a 5-volt pad instead of a 4V 5-volt pad, which is what I told you to do on some of those, the 5-volt pads won't power up unless you have battery power. So, a battery or your wall power supply. They won't power up on USB. So don't be too worried, I guess, in that case if it doesn't power up. If it's only wired to a 5-volt pad, you'll need battery power to get that going. Okay, one other note here in the serial port. So let's look at like 4, okay, 5. Okay, so right here we see 5 is set to -1. Okay, so -1 means none. There's nothing plugged into that UART. There's nothing communicating on that serial port. And I would highly recommend you go through all of the serials. Again, don't mess with 0. We'll leave 0 alone, but let's go through 1, okay, and 2, and 3, and make sure that if you don't have something physically plugged into that UART, you're not using that serial port, I would just set it to -1. Okay, just like this one, because that turns it off. It makes sure there's no weird communication errors. Hey, ArduPilot had a thing for a little while, I don't know if it's still there or not, where if you had say a GPS plugged into serial 6, okay, and then you had serial 3 protocol set to 5, set to GPS, the flight control, when it booted up, it would look through the serial port to say, do I have a GPS? Do I have a GPS? Serial 3 says it's GPS, but there's nothing on there. There's nothing plugged in. There's no signals. So I mustn't have a GPS, and it would stop looking for a GPS on the other serial ports. So it goes sequentially. So if you had a serial 6 GPS, but you had serial 3 turned to 5 as far as the protocol, you'd never find your GPS. You'd say, why can't it find my GPS? Why can't it do anything? Because it never found it. Okay, so turn off all the serial ports that you're not using. Okay, you should have at least 4 of them at this point of setup. You have your USB connection, serial 0, don't mess with that. Okay, you have your telemetry radio, you have your GPS, and you have your receiver. So it should be four serial ports, if I'm not mistaken, that should be active. The other ones can all be turned off unless you're using them for something else that's outside of class. Okay, so that should get that going with your GPS and your telemetry radio. Your compass, okay, is pretty much automatically detected upon boot up as long as you've wired it correctly. Okay, the compass is built into these little units here, or if you have the Pixhawk, it'd look slightly different, but it's basically auto configured. There's nothing you have to do inside Mission Planner typically, okay, unless you have disabled them from the other class, which many of you probably have, and so that's one step we'll look at here. But oftentimes they are auto configured. Okay. What you will want to do if you're not getting compass readings or anything like that, it's not working, okay, then you want to go in here to compass, just search for compass in the parameter list, and make sure the compass is enabled, okay. Many of you, I believe, disabled that in the other class. We talked about that in the maintenance class where we built the quads. We disabled that on purpose because we didn't have a compass. So you will want to enable it, okay, and just change that to 1 there. And if you have any, let's see, compass use is the other parameter. We want to look at that one there. Okay. Compass enable and compass use, you want to turn these back on if they're all disabled. So if they're all 0, then change it back to 1. That's all you should have to do to detect the compass. And then you just reboot the aircraft and it should detect it. Okay. The way you can tell if the compass is working and the GPS and the telemetry radio are working is a couple different ways here in the setup. You'll go ahead and you'll look for compass, okay? And now this is a simulated copter, so there's all these crazy compasses in here. You'll see 1 compass in there. You should see 1 or possibly 2 if you have your internal compass turned on as well. But you should see something here after you boot up. It will detect your compasses there. So that's good. Compass is working, okay? And on the data page, okay, you'll see GPS, and you may not see a fix if you're like indoors, but you'll see it won't say no GPS, it will say no fix. Okay, if it says no GPS, is not detected at all. You did something wrong. If it says no fix, that just means you haven't got a GPS fix yet, especially if you're indoors, like in a basement or something, or an apartment complex, you may not get a fix inside. Okay, so GPS, we can tell it's working by looking at the heads-up display here. Okay, telemetry radio, you know it's working if you connect to your aircraft wirelessly. That's pretty straightforward. That connection there will verify to you that telemetry radio is working. All right. Okay, that should cover everything for the Pixhawk. There we go.